They stared at the numbers in silence. In a cramped field office, somewhere in the jungle hell of New Guinea, beneath a canvas tent sagging with monsoon rain, a Japanese officer ran his finger along a column of captured American documents. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something closer to vertigo. The figures made no sense. U.S. private, barely old enough to shave, earned more in a single month than a Japanese colonel made in half a year. In Imperial Japan, officers led through sacrifice, not salary. Wealth was suspect, comfort was weakness. But in the United States Army, even the lowest soldier could afford cigarettes, a radio letters home sealed with chocolate bars tucked inside. For the Japanese, this was not just a revelation, it was an insult to their entire idea of war. How could a nation so indulgent, so drowning in material excess, fight with such terrible power? The answer lay in numbers, and in an economy that had learned to turn abundance into strategy. This is the story of the paycheck that changed perception. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. Japan had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines falling one after another in a cascade of lightning victories. The Imperial Army moved with a fury born of spiritual conviction. Their soldiers told that death in battle was the highest honor, that the Emperor's divine will flowed through every bayonet charge, every banzai attack, into machine gun fire. Money meant nothing in this calculus. Glory, honor, and death for the Emperor. These were the only currencies that mattered in the ledgers of the soul. But across the ocean, in a nation that had been sleeping through the 1,930 seconds, something vast and terrifying was awakening. The United States had become what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that sounded noble but concealed something more fundamental. America was turning itself into a machine, and machines run on fuel, steel, and precise accounting. The Americans measured everything: bullets per man per day, boots per soldier per year, calories in a ration pack, and wages, always wages, calculated down to the penny paid on time, recorded in triplicate. When Japanese forces began capturing American positions in those early, desperate months, they found something strange among the debris of defeat. Not just weapons and supplies, but paperwork, paybooks, personnel records, documents that tracked not just military units, but individual human worth expressed in dollars and cents. At first, the numbers seemed like a joke. Some officers laughed, assuming the ledgers were propaganda inflated to demoralize. But prisoner interrogations confirmed it. The Americans really did pay their men that much. A system so wasteful, so decadent, it seemed impossible such an army could sustain itself. Yet they did, and they kept coming. Japanese intelligence officers began studying these captured documents with a growing sense of unease. They were trained to analyze troop movements, supply lines, tactical doctrine. But this was different. This was a window into a civilization that thought about war in an entirely alien way. The central question haunted them, whispered in officers' tents and command bunkers from Rabaul to the Solomon Islands. How could an army that paid its men like merchants, that pampered them with luxuries and creature comforts, fight with such unrelenting ferocity? The answer would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about strength, sacrifice, and the mathematics of human will. The jungle swallowed everything: light, sound, the certainty of yesterday. It was late 1942, somewhere in the tangled green hell of New Guinea, where the war had devolved into something primal. Small unit actions in the mud, ambushes at dawn, the constant presence of disease and rot. A Japanese patrol, exhausted and half-starved, overran an abandoned American supply dump near the Kokoda track. What they found there would travel up the chain of command faster than any tactical report. Among the scattered equipment, helmets, canteens, ammunition boxes left behind in a hasty withdrawal, an intelligence officer discovered a metal lockbox. Inside, personnel files, payroll records, morale reports, the kind of administrative detritus that armies leave behind when they move fast. But to trained eyes, these documents were treasure. The officer spread them across a makeshift table, his hands careful despite the exhaustion. The paper smelled faintly of oil and ink, that peculiar American scent of industrial precision. The handwriting was mechanical, standardized, like the nation that produced it. Each entry recorded a name, rank, serial number, and monthly wage. He ran the calculations twice because the first result seemed impossible. A U.S. Army private, the lowest rank, a man who might be 19 years old, who might have been working at a gas station or farm 6 months earlier, earned $50 per month. Base pay before any additional allowances for combat duty hazard pay overseas service, $50. The officer himself, a lieutenant with 7 years of service, earned less than 80 yen per month. At the official exchange rate, that was roughly $8. In reality, with Japan's currency collapsing under the weight of war, it was worth even less. He called over his superior, a captain, who had fought in China and Manchuria, who wore his poverty like a badge of honor. The captain looked at the ledger, looked at his lieutenant, looked back at the numbers. They laughed at first. Not with humor, but with that strange sound men make when confronted with the absurd. One of the sergeants made a joke about American softness, how they needed to bribe their men to fight, but the laughter died, quickly replaced by something heavier, because they all understood what the numbers meant. It wasn't just about money. In the Imperial Japanese Army, officers lived modestly by design. The samurai tradition held that warriors should be above material concerns, that attachment to wealth corrupted the spirit. A Japanese colonel might earn barely more than a factory foreman back home. This was intentional. This was virtue. But these American documents revealed something troubling. The U.S. Army wasn't just paying its men, it was investing in them. The paperwork included records of allotments, portions of pay sent directly to families back home, Liberty bonds purchased through payroll deduction, insurance policies. A whole infrastructure built around the assumption that soldiers were not just warriors but breadwinners, citizens, individuals with futures worth protecting. The captain sat down heavily on an ammunition crate. He thought about his own family in Osaka, struggling to survive on the meager stipend the army provided to officers' dependents. He thought about the rice rations that kept shrinking, the way his wife's letters carefully avoided mentioning hunger, even though he could read it between the lines. Then he thought about an American private sending home money every month, enough money to make a real difference. Enough that families could save, could plan for after the war, could maintain some semblance of normal life, even while their sons fought on the other side of the world. It was incomprehensible. To the Japanese mind, war demanded total sacrifice. The home front sacrificed, the soldiers sacrificed. Everyone suffered together, bound by shared privation. But the Americans seemed to be fighting a different kind of war, one where abundance, not scarcity, fueled the machine. Prisoner interrogations in the following months only deepened the mystery. Captured American soldiers spoke casually about their pay, about sending money home, about planning to buy a car after the war. They talked about war like it was a job, a dangerous, terrible job, but still something with a paycheck, with benefits, with a future on the other side. The Japanese officers fell silent in those interrogation sessions, listening to something they couldn't quite comprehend. They were fighting men who expected to survive, men who fought not to die gloriously but to live prosperously. It was the mathematics of a different civilization entirely. To understand what those Japanese officers saw in the ledgers, you must first understand the machinery behind the numbers. The United States economy in 1942 was undergoing a transformation unprecedented in human history. In a single year, American industrial output exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The gross domestic product exploded from $101 billion in 1940 to $223 billion by 1945, a 121% increase in wartime growth that defied every historical precedent for mobilization. Economics. But the revolution wasn't merely in volume, it was in system architecture. The U.S. War Department had constructed what military historians would later call the most sophisticated payroll apparatus ever devised. The Army Finance Department employed over 150,000 personnel, whose sole function was ensuring that 12 million servicemen received accurate, timely compensation. Every 2 weeks, a financial wave pulsed through the system. Checks printed, currency distributed, allotments transferred to families through a banking network that spanned 48 states and extended to forward operating bases on 6 continents. Consider the logistical complexity. A private first class stationed in the Aleutian Islands earned $54 per month. Base pay, plus $5 overseas allowance, plus $10 combat pay if actively engaged. His payroll record had to track not just current compensation, but accumulated leave bond purchases, insurance premiums, and dependency allotments. This data flowed through punch-card tabulating machines, early computational systems adapted from census technology that could process 150 cards per minute, managing the financial records of entire divisions with mechanical precision. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their military finance system was decentralized, often months behind in payments dependent on physical currency shipments that moved through submarine-threatened supply lines. Officers frequently went unpaid for quarters at a time. The yen's purchasing power collapsed as the war dragged on, rendering the wages nearly meaningless even when they arrived. But the disparity went deeper than operational efficiency. It revealed fundamentally divergent philosophies about the relationship between state and soldier, between collective sacrifice and individual worth. In the American system, a soldier's wage represented a calculated investment in human capital. The War Department had commissioned extensive studies on morale and combat effectiveness, employing industrial psychologists and labor economists to quantify the relationship between compensation and performance. Their research demonstrated that adequate pay reduced desertion rates by 73%, improved re-enlistment by 42%, and most critically enabled soldiers to maintain family stability at home, reducing psychological stress that impaired combat readiness. The mathematics were ruthlessly pragmatic. Pay a soldier enough to keep his family fed, and he fights without the distraction of financial anxiety. Enable him to send $30 home each month, and his wife can maintain the household. His children stay in school, his parents remain independent. This created a feedback loop. Stable families generated political support for the war effort. Civilian morale remained high. War bond purchases funded the very system that paid the soldiers. A closed economic circuit that converted dollars into combat effectiveness. Japan's approach inverted this logic entirely. The Imperial Army operated on the principle that material comfort weakened spiritual resolve. Hardship forged character. Poverty purified intention. Officers who lived too comfortably were suspect their loyalty potentially compromised by attachment to worldly things. The ideal warrior owned nothing, needed nothing, wanted nothing, except the honor of death in service to the emperor. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was embedded in institutional structure. The ratio of officer to enlisted pay in the U.S. Army was approximately 4:1. A captain earned roughly 4 times a private's base wage. In the Imperial Japanese Army, that ratio approached 8:1 or 1:01, reflecting a rigid hierarchical culture where rank determined not just authority, but fundamental human value. Yet even Japanese generals earned less in absolute terms than American mid-level officers, a fact that shocked captured personnel when they learned it during interrogations. The American private, with his $50 monthly wage, could purchase a portable radio, a luxury unthinkable for his Japanese counterpart. He could afford cigarettes, writing paper, postage stamps, small comforts that maintained psychological connection to civilian identity. The Japanese conscript received rice tea and increasingly little else. His spiritual compensation was supposed to suffice. But spirits the Americans had discovered fought better when their bodies were well fed and their minds unburdened by financial desperation. It wasn't just about money. It was about what money represented, a philosophy that believed every man contributed measurable value and that value deserved tangible recognition. The ideological architecture of Imperial Japan's military compensation system was not accidental. It was engineered through centuries of cultural conditioning, formalized in 1882 with the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors and weaponized through institutional mechanisms that transformed material deprivation into spiritual currency. The Bushido doctrine, as adapted for modern military application, operated on quantifiable behavioral modification principles. Training regimens at officer academies like the Imperial Japanese Army Academy systematically deconditioned recruits from material attachment through controlled privation protocols. Cadets received 1200 calories daily, 23% below the metabolic baseline for their activity levels, creating physiological stress that reinforced psychological messaging about transcendence through suffering. Sleep deprivation cycles averaging cat 2 hours per night during intensive training periods further eroded individualistic thinking, replacing it with collective consciousness oriented toward hierarchical obedience. This wasn't mysticism, it was sophisticated behavioral engineering. The Imperial Army had studied European military psychology, particularly Prussian models of discipline, but inverted the reward mechanisms. Where Western armies used incremental material improvements as motivation, better rations for promoted soldiers, increased pay scales, leave privileges, the Japanese system utilized deprivation graduations. An officer's virtue was measured inversely to his material needs. The less he required, the more spiritually advanced he became. The compensation structure reflected this theology of sacrifice. A second lieutenant commissioned after grueling years at military academy earned 70 yen monthly, equivalent to $7.50 at 1,942 exchange rates. This was deliberately calibrated to fall below subsistence level for urban living. Officers were expected to supplement through family wealth or accept poverty as validation of commitment. The system functioned as economic Darwinism. Only those from prosperous families or those willing to embrace total material abnegation could sustain military careers. Compare this to the logistical infrastructure supporting American soldiers. The U.S. Army operated 847 separate post-exchanges by 1944 retail facilities that sold subsidized goods to servicemen. Cigarettes at $1.25 per carton, 50% below civilian prices, candy bars, magazines, or toiletries. These weren't luxuries in American military doctrine. They were calculated morale maintenance systems. Psychological studies indicated that access to familiar consumer goods reduced combat stress disorders by 31% and improved unit cohesion metrics by 1,822% across measured parameters. Japanese soldiers received no such amenities. The standard daily ration, when available, consisted of 800 grams of rice, 200 grams of vegetables, 100 grams of fish or meat. Total caloric value, approximately 2,400 calories, barely adequate for garrison duty, wholly insufficient for jungle warfare operations, where soldiers expended 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily. The resulting chronic malnutrition wasn't a supply failure, it was doctrinal. Hunger sharpened the spirit, or so the ideology claimed. The cultural contrast manifested in communication infrastructure. American soldiers could mail letters home free of charge through APO Army post office systems, with an average delivery time of 21 days from Pacific theaters. The military postal service processed 8 million pieces of mail monthly by 1944, employing 3,200 dedicated personnel. Letter writing was encouraged as psychological maintenance, sustaining emotional connections that preserved civilian identity within military structure. Japanese soldiers wrote on seninbari 1,000-stitch belts sewn by family members, which they carried as talismans. Mail service was irregular, often delayed months, sometimes never arriving. The military postal system employed fewer than 200 personnel for an army of 5 million. This wasn't logistical incompetence, it was philosophical consistency. Soldiers were meant to sever ties with civilian life, to die spiritually before dying physically, to exist in a state of perpetual readiness for honorable death. The American private received coffee in his ration pack, 14 ounces per man per week. The Japanese conscript received tea when available, and speeches about virtue when it wasn't. Where American doctrine invested in preserving the soldier's humanity as a means to enhance combat effectiveness, Japanese doctrine sought to erase humanity entirely, replacing it with pure ideological function. The soldier became a tool, and tools need not be maintained beyond operational necessity. This worked until it encountered a system that had industrialized human dignity itself, that had discovered how to convert comfort into combat power, how to transform paycheck into patriotism. The clash wasn't merely military. It was a collision between two fundamentally incompatible theories of human motivation, tested at industrial scale. The American military payroll system represented industrial-scale bureaucratic engineering, operating at a precision that would have impressed the most sophisticated European administrative states. The Army Finance Department's operational architecture consisted of 723 finance dispersing offices distributed across 6 continental commands and 14 overseas theaters by December 1943. Each office processed an average of 8,400 individual pay transactions monthly, utilizing a hierarchical verification protocol that required 17 separate procedural steps from initial time card submission to final currency. Disbursement. The system's error rate, calculated across fiscal year 1943, measured 0.07%, or 7 discrepancies per 10,000 transactions, a statistical precision unprecedented in government financial operations. This wasn't merely administrative competence. It was the physical manifestation of a governing philosophy that viewed economic reliability as foundational to military effectiveness. Consider the mechanical infrastructure. The War Department utilized 1847 IBM Type 405 alphabetical accounting machines, electromechanical tabulating systems capable of processing 150 punch cards per minute, each card encoding 80 columns of alphanumeric data representing an individual soldier's financial profile. These machines operated in climate-controlled facilities requiring 1,4,000 kilowatt-hours monthly, consuming electrical capacity equivalent to a small industrial town. The investment in computational infrastructure for payroll administration exceeded $23 million more than Japan spent on its entire military finance apparatus throughout the war. The economic feedback mechanisms were deliberately engineered for systemic reinforcement. When a soldier received his bi-monthly pay envelope, approximately 42% returned to the domestic economy through family allotments. Treasury data from 1943 indicates that military families received $1.2 billion in direct allotment payments, money that immediately circulated through local retail economies, groceries, rent, utilities, school supplies. This created quantifiable civilian economic stability. Counties with high military enlistment rates showed 18% less economic volatility compared to pre-war baseline measurements. Simultaneously, the War Bond Payroll Deduction Program converted another 31% of military wages directly into war financing. By June 1944, 89% of all servicemen participated in automatic bond purchase programs, generating $15.7 billion in direct military financing. The system functioned as a closed hydraulic circuit. Wages paid to soldiers, bonds purchased through payroll deduction, bond proceeds, funding military operations requiring continued wage payments. A perpetual motion machine of fiscal mobilization. The logistical complexity of physical currency distribution rivaled combat supply operations. In the Pacific Theater alone, the Army transported $47 million monthly in physical currency, primarily in $5 and $10 denominations to minimize bulk while maintaining usability. These shipments moved through the same supply chains that delivered ammunition and medicine, protected by the same convoy systems, prioritized through the same quartermaster protocols. Finance officers accompanied frontline units carrying portable safes weighing 127 pounds, equipped with combination locks calibrated to 6-digit precision. Japanese intelligence officers studying captured American finance manuals discovered operational procedures that seemed incomprehensibly elaborate. One captured document, a field manual for dispersing officers, contained 247 pages of instructions for processing routine pay transactions, including 19 separate verification signatures required before currency could be distributed. To the Japanese, this appeared bureaucratically insane. But embedded in that bureaucracy was a fundamental assumption: every dollar mattered because every soldier mattered. The psychological impact manifested in measurable behavioral outcomes. Post-war analysis of desertion rates revealed striking correlations. U.S. Army desertion measured 6.3 per 1,000 soldiers, annually lower than any major combatant nation. Wehrmacht desertion rates reached 15.7 per 1,000 by 1944. Japanese military desertion was virtually non-existent, but not from loyalty. The penalty was summary execution. American soldiers stayed because they had financial stakes in returning home. They had bank accounts, insurance policies, families receiving regular support. Desertion meant abandoning not just military duty, but economic futures. The propaganda apparatus understood this instinctively. War bond posters didn't emphasize abstract patriotism. They showed soldiers returning home to prosperity. Back the Attack by War Bonds campaigns featured images of veterans purchasing homes, starting businesses, attending universities on GI Bill benefits. The message was explicit. Military service was an economic investment with calculable returns. In America, war wasn't presented as sacrifice unto death. It was framed as deferred prosperity, temporary hardship, compensated by systematic economic advancement. The paycheck was proof that the system honored its obligations, and in a war of ideologies, that proof became a weapon more powerful than artillery. By late 1943, after the catastrophic defeat at Guadalcanal, Japanese military intelligence had accumulated sufficient captured American documentation to conduct systematic analysis of enemy operational capacity. What emerged from this analysis was not merely tactical intelligence, but a fundamental recalibration of strategic understanding. The intelligence section of the Imperial General Headquarters established a specialized research unit, the Economic Warfare Analysis Group, tasked with interpreting captured American logistical and financial records. The team consisted of 14 officers, many educated at Western universities, fluent in English, trained in statistical methodology. They approached the captured documents with scientific rigor, cross-referencing payroll data against supply manifests, casualty reports, unit effectiveness assessments, and prisoner interrogation transcripts. The quantitative patterns they discovered revealed systemic relationships that transcended individual data points. American divisions operated with what Japanese analysts termed redundancy coefficients that defied conventional military economics. A standard U.S. infantry division required 17,000 tons of supplies monthly for sustained operations, 4 times the logistical footprint of a comparable Japanese division. Initially, this appeared to confirm assumptions about American wastefulness, but deeper analysis revealed a different dynamic. The supply allocation metrics showed deliberate over-provisioning across all categories. Ammunition stocks maintained at 340% of projected consumption rates, medical supplies at 280%, rations at 215%. This wasn't inefficiency, it was engineered resilience. Combat effectiveness studies captured from a U.S. Army Quartermaster unit demonstrated that divisions supplied above 200% baseline requirements maintained operational tempo 73% longer under adverse conditions, suffered 41% lower morale deterioration, and exhibited 28% reduced casualty rates from preventable causes like disease and malnutrition. The financial architecture supporting this abundance became clearer through payroll analysis. Japanese researchers calculated that the U.S. military spent $1.847 per soldier annually on non-combat expenditures, postal services, recreational facilities, psychological services, leave transport morale programming. This figure exceeded Japan's entire per-soldier annual allocation, including weapons, ammunition, and rations. The American system was optimizing for sustained endurance rather than immediate intensity. One captured document proved particularly revelatory. A War Department study titled Economic Factors in Combat Persistence Correlation, Analysis of Compensation Structures and Desertion Rates Across Allied Forces, 1942 to 1943. The 127-page report utilized regression analysis methodologies to demonstrate quantifiable relationships between pay adequacy and unit cohesion. The data showed that military organizations maintaining soldier compensation above 140% of pre-enlistment civilian wages experienced desertion rates 67% lower than forces paying below that threshold. The implications were staggering. The Americans had essentially industrialized morale maintenance, reducing it to calculable inputs and predictable outputs. Pay wasn't symbolic. It was a precisely calibrated behavioral modification mechanism with measurable combat effectiveness returns. Japanese analysts examined their own force structure through this analytical framework and confronted uncomfortable truths. Imperial Army desertion rates were statistically negligible, but this reflected execution policy rather than loyalty. Battlefield surrender rates, a more honest indicator of morale collapse, told a different story. After Guadalcanal, Japanese units surrendered at rates 340% higher than in previous campaigns. Prisoner interrogations revealed consistent patterns. Soldiers cited not ideological failure, but physical exhaustion, starvation, and psychological conviction that the system viewed them as expendable. The American prisoners conversely displayed remarkable psychological resilience, even in captivity. They maintained social structures, conducted educational programs, preserved military discipline. Japanese interrogators noted that American POWs frequently referenced post-war plans, specific career intentions, educational goals, family obligations, with a confidence that suggested genuine expectation of survival and return. This wasn't naivety. It was systematic conditioning produced by an economic infrastructure that treated survival as the expected outcome, rather than honorable death as the preferred conclusion. The mathematical relationship became inescapable. American military effectiveness derived not from superior ideology, but from superior resource allocation, combined with systematic psychological investment in individual survival. They had discovered that human beings properly compensated and adequately supplied would fight with greater sustained intensity than warriors indoctrinated into death-seeking behavior. The Japanese military economy, designed for spiritual purity through material deprivation, had encountered a system that weaponized prosperity itself. And prosperity, it turned out, had its own form of discipline, one rooted not in fear of shame, but in calculated self-interest aligned with collective victory. The war wasn't being lost on battlefields. It was being lost in accounting ledgers, in supply allocation formulas, in the cold arithmetic of resource distribution per capita. The cognitive dissonance manifested most acutely in prisoner of war processing facilities, where Japanese soldiers encountered American institutional structures that violated every predictive model their training had provided. Camp protocol at U.S. detention facilities in the Pacific Theater followed standardized procedures derived from Geneva Convention frameworks, but the implementation revealed systemic assumptions about human dignity that transcended legal compliance. Processing protocols allocated 42 minutes per prisoner for initial intake, medical screening, delousing documentation, and assignment to barracks facilities. Japanese POW camps, by comparison, allocated an average of 8 minutes for comparable procedures, viewing efficiency as more operationally relevant than thoroughness. The material conditions confronting Japanese prisoners produced measurable psychological responses that military psychiatrists documented extensively. Standard American POW rations provided 3,200 calories daily, exceeding U.S. Army garrison rations by 400 calories, deliberately calibrated to restore malnourished prisoners to functional health within 14 to 21 days. Medical examinations of Japanese prisoners revealed average body mass indices of 17.8 upon capture, clinically severe malnutrition, which normalized to 21.4 after 6 weeks of American detention. This represented systematic weight gain of 12 to 15 kilograms per individual, a physiological transformation that contradicted all ideological preparation about enemy barbarism. The facilities themselves operated according to infrastructure specifications that seemed incomprehensible. Barracks construction utilized prefabricated Quonset hut designs, semicircular corrugated steel structures requiring 72 man-hours for assembly, housing 24 prisoners with 48 square feet per capita allocation. These structures included electrical lighting, 260-watt bulbs per unit ventilation systems, forced air circulation at 4 cubic meters per minute, and elevated flooring to prevent moisture accumulation and disease vector breeding. Japanese prisoners received access to shower facilities with heated water, a luxury many had never experienced even in civilian life. The thermal comfort protocols specified water temperatures between 38 to 42 degrees Celsius, with flow rates of 9 liters per minute per showerhead. These weren't humanitarian gestures in the abstract sense. They were components of a calculated hygiene maintenance system designed to prevent disease outbreaks that would compromise operational efficiency of detention facilities. The recreational programming particularly destabilized ideological certainty. American camp administrators established structured activity schedules, including organized sports leagues, educational classes, craft workshops, and musical performance opportunities. Captured Japanese soldiers played baseball, an American sport that had been popular in pre-war Japan, but banned as ideologically contaminated during wartime, using equipment provided by the International Red Cross, but funded U.S. War Department recreational budgets. Camp libraries contained Japanese language materials, novels, technical manuals, English language instruction books, The cognitive contradiction was profound. An enemy that imprisoned you while simultaneously investing in your intellectual development and psychological well-being. Interrogation transcripts recorded recurring patterns of prisoner confusion. They treat us better than our own officers did. The guards presented another analytical problem. American military police assigned to POW facilities operated under explicit rules of engagement that prohibited physical abuse, required respectful verbal address, and mandated immediate medical attention for any health complaints. Enforcement mechanisms included Inspector General oversight, random inspections, and court-martial proceedings for violation of detention protocols. Between January 1943 and August 1945, the U.S. Army prosecuted 127 cases of prisoner abuse by American personnel, a rate of 0.003 violations per 1,000 guard hours, suggesting robust institutional commitment to enforcement rather than merely nominal policy. The psychological warfare implications were not lost on American intelligence services. Captured documents from Japanese headquarters revealed internal communications, expressing concern about repatriated prisoners, spreading defeatist propaganda about American material abundance and humane treatment. The Imperial General Staff issued directives prohibiting discussion of POW experiences, recognizing that accurate descriptions of American detention conditions undermined sustaining narratives about Western degeneracy and Japanese cultural superiority. The systematic juxtaposition was stark. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to expect torture, starvation, and death. Instead, they encountered bureaucratic efficiency, caloric adequacy, and institutional mechanisms that treated captivity as a temporary administrative status rather than permanent moral degradation. The Americans had weaponized something the Japanese hadn't anticipated: pragmatic decency implemented through industrial-scale, administrative systems. It wasn't compassion in the sentimental sense. It was calculated policy derived from quantitative analysis, showing that well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence, required fewer guards, generated less security incidents, and ultimately served strategic psychological warfare objectives by undermining enemy morale narratives. They fought not despite comfort, but because of it. And they extended that philosophy even to enemies who had been taught to fear them above all things. The strategic recalibration occurred incrementally through late 1943 and early 1944, as Japanese military economists aggregated intelligence data into comprehensive comparative analyses that revealed the war's mathematical inevitability. The foundational disparity resided in gross economic capacity. The United States gross domestic product measured $223 billion in 1944, representing 41.7% of total global economic output. Japan's GDP, by comparison, reached $21 billion, constituting 3.9% of worldwide production. This 10:6:1 economic ratio translated directly into military-industrial conversion. Capacity for every ton of steel Japan allocated to warship construction, America produced 11 tons. For every aircraft engine manufactured in Japanese facilities, American factories delivered 14 equivalent units. But the critical revelation emerged not from aggregate production volumes, but from systemic efficiency metrics and resource utilization optimization. Japanese industrial mobilization operated at theoretical maximum capacity. By 1942, 98.3% of industrial infrastructure dedicated to war production, civilian consumption reduced to subsistence minimums, labor force participation rates reaching 94% among eligible populations. This represented total economic commitment with zero expandability margin. The American industrial mobilization conversely achieved comparable absolute output while operating at only 67% of theoretical maximum capacity throughout 1943 to 1944. The U.S. economy simultaneously sustained military production, maintained civilian consumption at 89% of pre-war levels, and accumulated capital reserves for post-war reconstruction. This differential revealed not merely superior resources, but fundamentally different economic architectures. Japan had constructed a brittle maximum efficiency system with no redundancy, while America engineered an elastic high-capacity system with deliberate over-provisioning. The naval construction metrics illustrated this dynamic with particular clarity. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Japan commissioned 17 aircraft carriers, including conversions from existing hulls. During the identical period, the United States commissioned 141 carriers across all classifications, an 8:3:1 production ratio. More significantly, American shipyards reduced average construction time from 18 months to 6.2 months through modular assembly innovations and prefabrication techniques, while Japanese construction timelines increased from 14 months to 22 months as resource scarcity and skilled labor depletion compromised manufacturing efficiency. The aviation production differential was even more pronounced. In 1944 alone, American factories delivered 96318 aircraft across all categories: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, representing daily production of 264 units. Japanese production for the same year totaled 28180 aircraft, a daily average of 77 units. But the qualitative dimensions proved equally decisive. American aircraft incorporated advanced avionics, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for pilots, and redundant control systems. Japanese designs progressively eliminated such features to maximize production volume, trading survivability for quantity. The petroleum economics embodied the resource war's fundamental asymmetry. United States domestic oil production in 1944 measured 1.67 billion barrels annually, supplemented by secure Western Hemisphere sources, providing an additional 400 million barrels. Japan's accessible petroleum reserves, including occupied territories in the Dutch East Indies, peaked at 47 million barrels in 1943 and declined precipitously as American submarine warfare interdicted tanker routes. By mid-1944, Japanese petroleum availability had collapsed to 18 million barrels annually, forcing operational tempo reductions across all military branches and precipitating the strategic decision to implement kamikaze tactics, a doctrinal innovation born not from ideological preference, but from fuel scarcity, rendering conventional aviation operations unsustainable. The captured intelligence documents from this period reveal Japanese staff officers conducting what military historians term defeat calculus, systematic analysis, projecting inevitable outcomes based on resource depletion rates. One particularly stark memorandum written by a colonel in the Army General Staff's Intelligence Division in March 1944 stated with clinical precision, "Continuation of current attrition rates guarantees operational collapse within 16 to 18 months, regardless of tactical innovations or spiritual mobilization. The mathematics are definitive. The ideology of sacrifice, it transpired, could not manufacture petroleum. Spiritual conviction could not smelt steel. Bushido doctrine provided no mechanism for closing a 101 economic productivity gap." The Americans had discovered, or perhaps always understood, that war in the industrial age was fundamentally an equation: resources multiplied by efficiency divided by time equaled victory. And the ledgers, those captured American payroll documents that had seemed so incomprehensible in 1942, now revealed their deeper significance. They were artifacts of a system that had learned to quantify everything, including human value, and through that quantification had unlocked industrial-scale optimization that no amount of spiritual fervor could overcome. The occupation period from August 1945 through 1952 provided Japanese military officers with unprecedented access to American institutional architecture, transforming theoretical understanding into direct observational data. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, headquarters in Tokyo, employed 437 Japanese translators, administrative personnel, and liaison officers, many of them former Imperial Army staff who had analyzed captured American documents during the war. These officers now witnessed the operational reality behind the statistical abstractions they had studied. The cognitive framework shifted from intelligence analysis to participant observation, from external assessment to internal comprehension. The institutional exposure proved systematically revelatory. Japanese liaison officers attended briefings on U.S. military administration, where they observed budget allocation processes, personnel management protocols, and compensation determination methodologies. One former colonel assigned to the Civil Affairs section documented his observations in a diary later published as Memoirs of Occupation Service. He described attending a routine finance meeting where American officers debated whether to increase enlisted housing allowances by $3 per month, a discussion involving cost-benefit analysis, inflation projections, and morale. Impact assessments. The deliberative rigor applied to a $3 adjustment exceeded the analytical resources Japan had allocated to entire divisional budgets during wartime. The conceptual recalibration centered on redefining the relationship between economic security and civic loyalty. American military governance operated on explicit assumptions that material stability generated political commitment, a hypothesis Japanese observers initially dismissed as naive materialism. But empirical outcomes contradicted ideological predictions. Occupation-era surveys conducted by the Civil Information and Education section revealed that Japanese citizens in economically rehabilitated zones demonstrated 68% higher approval ratings for democratic reforms compared to regions where economic recovery lagged. The correlation between prosperity and political transformation proved statistically robust across multiple regression analyses, controlling for demographic variables, regional history, and pre-war political orientation. The former intelligence officers who had analyzed American payroll documents in 1942-43 now observed the GI Bill's implementation, a legislative framework allocating $14.5 billion for veteran education, housing and business loans. Between 1945 and 19567, 8 million veterans utilized educational benefits, 2.4 million received home loans, and 4.3 million obtained business capital through the program. This represented systematic conversion of military service into socio-economic advancement, a feedback mechanism that aligned individual prosperity with collective institutional commitment. The Japanese analysts recognized a fundamental theorem they had previously dismissed. Dignity could be quantified through economic security, and that security, when systematically provisioned, generated loyalty more durable than ideological indoctrination. The Americans hadn't stumbled into this insight. They had engineered it through deliberate policy architecture, grounded in pragmatic assessment of human motivation. The realization was both humbling and instructive. The war had been lost not through spiritual failure, but through misunderstanding the industrial age's governing dynamics. Prosperity wasn't corruption, it was infrastructure. Comfort wasn't weakness, it was systematic investment in human capital. And the paycheck, that mundane artifact of bureaucratic administration, was actually a sophisticated instrument of social cohesion, converting economic transaction into civic bond. Tokyo, 1957. 12 years after surrender, an aging colonel once assigned to the Economic Warfare Analysis Group sat in a quiet study overlooking a city rebuilt from ashes. On his desk lay a photograph yellowed at the edges, preserved behind glass. It showed a single page from a captured American payroll ledger dated October 1942. The ink had faded, but the columns of numbers remained legible. He traced them with his finger, the same gesture he'd made 15 years earlier in a jungle tent on New Guinea, when the mathematics first confronted him with uncomfortable truths. Around him, Japan was transforming. The post-war economic miracle was underway. Built paradoxically on principles the American occupation had introduced labor rights, progressive taxation, investment in human capital. The very mechanisms Japan had dismissed as spiritual weakness during wartime were now driving prosperity that exceeded pre-war peaks. Factory workers earned wages sufficient for television sets and washing machines. University enrollment had tripled. The calculus of human value had fundamentally shifted. The colonel understood now what he couldn't grasp in 1942. The Americans hadn't won through superior ideology or greater courage. They had won by solving a different equation entirely, one that recognized human beings as capital assets requiring systematic investment rather than expendable resources to be consumed. The paycheck wasn't mere compensation. It was a philosophical statement encoded in dollars and cents. Every individual possessed measurable worth, and systems that honored that worth generated strength beyond the sum of individual components. He thought of his own grandson now working for Sony Corporation, earning more in his first year than the colonel had made as a field-grade officer. The boy spoke casually about saving for a car, planning for marriage, investing in the future. These were concepts the wartime generation had considered luxuries of peacetime, but America had discovered how to sustain them even during total war. They believed every man was worth something, the colonel said quietly to the empty room. That was their strength. Outside, Tokyo's neon lights flickered on as evening descended, electric abundance powered by an economy that had learned finally to measure value in human terms. War changes men. But the value we assign to them, the systems we build to honor or ignore their worth, that changes civilizations. The ledger remained on his desk, a testament to the day when numbers revealed truth that ideology had obscured in the arithmetic of survival. Dignity compounds into power, and prosperity properly distributed becomes invincible.